Okay, hello. I want to talk to you about teacher-creator perspective on the design of cybersecurity educational resources. So this work is based on McLeod's master's thesis in HCI, who was co-supervised with Elizabeth. To give you a bit of background on the motivation of the work, we've done a survey of cybersecurity educational tools a few years ago. In the last 20 years or so, we found a lot of them. So there's comics, there's games, there's tabletop games, there's multi-variety of different types of interactive and multimedia resources. And we've done some of this work in our own lab as well, and some of this work, of course, by the wonderful people at SOUPS. You might recognize some of the pieces here. So we found only about 30% of these tools received evaluation. So by this we mean, like, in terms of how do we actually assess the learning outcomes and the effectiveness of these tools. So these included things like engagement, usability, the learning outcomes. And as a community, we saw kind of a low level of adoption by the public in terms of there seems a low level of adoption of people actually using these resources. So from a cybersecurity education perspective, we wanted to understand when teachers seek out these resources. By here, teachers we're talking about, specifically in this work we tackled middle school teachers. What type of things do they actually consider when choosing these resources for delivery in the classroom? And for the creators, so I would consider myself a creator because I worked in this space, but by creators we mean people who took an active role in the creation of cybersecurity educational tool. So these people could include designers, developers, in some cases educational director, and even project managers who were actually working on projects related to cybersecurity education and were developing these tools. So what type of things do they actually consider when curating, designing, and evaluating these tools? And the end goal is really to look at areas of alignment and misalignment in terms of what are the processes that were considered, and do they actually meet the needs of teachers who actually have to use these resources for their students. So we took a general semi-structured interviewed approach. Joy actually had some teaching experience herself. So in terms of analysis, we did a reflexive thematic analysis using some of Joy's first-hand experiences as a teacher in the reflexive analysis of the data. And for teachers, we asked things like, what are their experiences of teaching cybersecurity and privacy? How do they select the resources for teaching? And how effective in general do they find these resources to be? On the creator side, we wanted to understand their processes. So I have a design background, so I have a very particular process when I approached these resources when designing them in my own work. But in general, we wanted to learn how do other people approach this process as well. How did I accommodate different needs? There's a really wide range of age group we're dealing with, even dealing with children in general. Designing something for like a 7-year-old is very different than designing a tool for teens, for example. And how could these design processes being improved?
So we were able to recruit participants from both groups. We recruited 15 Canadian middle school teachers. We restricted it to Canadian teachers to hopefully keep the educational context relatively similar. Of these, about 2/3 were female, and they had a wide range of teaching experience, ranging from being in their first year of teaching to somewhere maybe even nearing the end of their career at around 35 years of experience. the vast majority of them taught in public schools, which also pretty much, I think, reflects the landscape of middle school education in Canada. We also asked them about their own educational background to kind of see where they were coming from. And 87% of them had a university degree in an arts-related field. We were also able to recruit 8 creators, and they came from a variety of roles, as Leah was referencing, including designer, developer, project manager, and educational director. Half were female, and all but one were based in Canada. And the majority of them had quite a bit of career experience. 3/4 of them said they were in mid to late career. And 3/4 of them had graduate degrees. To give you a sense of what the teachers told us about the topics they were teaching and what kind of resources they were using, you can see these 2 graphs. So teachers were most likely to say that they had taught topics relating to cyberbullying and kind of generalized cybersecurity, as well as privacy. They were least likely to have tackled topics relating to authentication, gambling, and pornography. And in terms of the kinds of resources that they were most frequently using, lesson plans and learning modules were at the top of the list, with less attention paid or fewer resources used. There were more kind of heavyweight games, animations, videos, that kind of thing. And so in this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on our 3rd research question about kind of comparing and contrasting what we were hearing from the teachers and the creators to see whether or not they align. And in these 2 sets of interviews, we heard very different approaches to cybersecurity education. From teachers, we overwhelmingly heard that they were likely to approach cybersecurity as part of safety-related topics. They said that cybersecurity tended to come up in an ad hoc and reactive kind of manner. They were reacting to events in the classroom, events in the school, events in the broader community, or even in the media that were affecting their students. Maybe a student was cyberbullied, maybe an explicit photo of a student had been circulated, etc. But they were bringing up these topics in relationship to what was happening in students' lives. This meant that they took tended to take a really reflective approach that prioritized things like class discussions, stories, and role play. They were really seeking to connect to students' lived experience. And they also preferred informal assessment to kind of match this atmosphere, as you can see in this quote. They were prioritizing the safety of their students, their emotional safety, but also the emotional safety of themselves in some cases. And although it's easy to think about, cybersecurity from our perspective as being quite a technical subject, teachers never seemed to be approaching it from perspectives relating to math or science or even computing. In contrast, creators were likely to describe how they were framing cybersecurity as part of a dedicated lesson plan, something with preordained time and planning that went into it. And creators almost never brought up the circumstances under which cybersecurity would come up in the classroom. As we dwelt on these 2 perspectives, it occurred to us that essentially educators and resources creators are approaching the same problem from kind of 2 different topics, or 2 different perspectives. And that problem is, how can cybersecurity topics be best synthesized for delivery to students? However, it seems that teachers are really trying hard to fit the available resources they have to their circumstances. They're reacting to emergent events in the classroom, but they also have external pressures. They have the communities they live in and, say, the political nature of them. They have the demands of curriculum. They have their principals, the schools that they operate in. And they also just have a real paucity of classroom time and resources. There's a lot for them to cover. There's a lot of things to prioritize. There's a lot more things that they could be talking about. And so they're really just squishing it in wherever they can, where they need to, in reaction to what students need. But in contrast, creators described starting with this kind of blank slate. They talked about saying, oh, well, we start out by thinking about trends in cybersecurity, what's important for students to know. The other thing that they brought up were funding considerations. They talked about how, there are often hot topics in security that's easier to find funding to develop materials around, and that they also are able to find funding that go with different types of resources as well, that gamified resources and videos in particular are more likely to be funded for development. Creators explicitly acknowledge that there's little direct feedback from teachers or students in their design process. At the end of this quote, somebody said, well, what are the students really experiencing? How are they digesting that information? And they really acknowledge that they don't know. And then finally, this disparity that we noticed is that, as Leah is saying, there's a wide variety of teaching resources available, but as far as we can tell, little of this content makes it through to students. So what's going on there? And we think it's that the resources and materials created and disseminated by creators often don't match teachers' classroom constraints and needs. And what happens is that teachers just don't use a lot of these resources. Many of the available resources are games and videos, but in our interviews, teachers reported using them infrequently because they were hard to adapt to these emergent and reactive contexts that they were talking to their students in. In contrast, they preferred, is that my get off the stage music? Okay, all right, thanks. They preferred text resources and lesson plans, stuff that they could update. They could swap, the references to Facebook to references to TikTok. They could modernize. They could adapt the contexts to match what their students were experiencing. They could cut it into smaller chunks to use in their available time. And so we think they really need simple, and they spoke to the need for simple, flexible, and modular resources. And so we don't want to make it sound like resource creators are totally out of touch. In our interviews, we thought that resource creators generally had a good understanding of the learning needs and interests of the students, but they generally weren't prioritizing their design considerations for teachers' delivery of the material in the classroom, which it appears is kind of a big part of how they get to students. And so as a result, our findings suggest that teachers only use a fraction of the teaching resources that are available. They're looking for modular lessons. Modular lessons are looking for lesson plans, and they're looking for things like short videos that they can fit into other discussions and quickly adapt to the changing contexts in which they're teaching. So thank you so much. We'd be delighted to take questions.